Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm the other Doug Buchanan, Editor-in-Chief of Columbus Business First and a proud member of CMC's Board of Trustees. Thank you for today's presenting sponsor, the Columbus Council on World Affairs. We'll hear more about this new partnership between the Council of World Affairs and CMC in just a moment. Thank you as well to today's forum sponsor, The Ohio State University. Today's live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. Okay, on to today's forum. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has reshaped the international world order and created a life-threatening crisis for the Ukrainian people. Today, our expert panel will examine the causes and impacts of this ongoing conflict. On behalf of today's presenting sponsor, please welcome Patrick Terrian, President and CEO of the Columbus Council of World Affairs, to introduce our distinguished speakers. Patrick.
Thank you, Doug. My name is Patrick Terrian, although today I wish my name were also Doug Buchanan. That's so amazing. We're really proud to be here today to partner with our good friends from the Columbus Metropolitan Club. For many years, Jane and I have coordinated programs and helped bring global issues to the local forefront. What we're starting today is a partnership. So over the course of the year, we'll have at least 4 internationally themed programs that are delivered through the Columbus Metropolitan Club. They can do what they're best at, and we can do what we're best at. Right now, our focus is on high school students. We reach 1,200 high school students in 20 school districts in this area, and we're now going national with our Global Scholars Diploma program. So thanks, Jane and her great team, for being innovative and open to partnership, and we hope that this provides you, as members of both organizations, something that enriches. On to today's program. So please welcome today's speakers, all from The Ohio State University, which I think also tips off soon in the March Madness. Though no, everyone should be paying attention. First is Dr. Christopher Gelpi, the Director and Chair of Peace Studies and Conflict Resolution with the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, and he's a Professor of Political Science. Next to him is Philip Kopatz, a grad student at the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And next to him is Myroslava Mudrak, Doctor, Professor Emeritus with the Department of History of Art. And Mykyta Tyshchenko, to her left, your right, is a grad student as well for the Center of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And please, let's give them a round of applause. You already did great. You already got a round of applause. So, and let me introduce today's distinguished moderator for the program, Dr. Angela Brintlinger. She's the director for the Center of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Angela.
Thank you, Patrick and Doug and Jane, for having us here. We're really happy to be here. As was mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and I'm also a professor primarily of Russian literature and culture at Ohio State, where I've been for 28 years. So we brought together this group of really smart, interesting people to try to share with you a little bit about what is going on in Ukraine and some of the background, some of what we see as what's happening. All of us who are in regional studies have been called on a lot by our neighbors, by our friends, by our colleagues, by news organizations in recent weeks, obviously, because Ukraine is in the news, and we know about Ukraine. So we want to share that with you. But I want to open with an anecdote. As you know, on the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine using rockets, rocket fire, bombing, et cetera, escalating a war that has been going on for almost 8 years. The next day, the Ukrainian Society on campus at Ohio State, the students had a bake sale. and rally on the Oval. And they were selling cupcakes, blue and yellow cupcakes, blue and yellow donuts, and they were sharing the news that Ukraine was in danger and that we in the United States and all over the world needed to pay more attention. So I was standing there just watching them a little bit off to the side, and a young man came up to me and he said, "What's going on?" I said, "Oh, you know, Ukraine is being shelled and these people are here, you know, doing this rally to try to help other people understand about it." And he said, what does that mean, shelled? I said, "Oh, well, you know, bombing the cities." And he said, "Oh, I'm from Somalia. I know about bombing. My country is bombed frequently. Can I go and give them some money?" So that day, those students raised $7,000, 24 hours after this invasion was escalating. And that was the first of their rallies. They had one, some of you may have seen, at the State House the following Saturday. They had another one on campus, and they have been working to increase opportunities for humanitarian aid and to increase awareness of what's going on in Ukraine. So I just wanted to start with that. And I wanted to, you know, all of you know so much more about Ukraine now than you may have known 3 weeks ago. Everyone who listens to the radio, reads newspapers, watches television, has neighbors. My eye doctor told me his neighbor is Ukrainian, and he recognized immediately what my ribbons meant when I came to get my new glasses. But I want to present my colleagues and students to you. Each of them has very specific knowledge, and I hope that they'll be able to share it with us. And I wanted to start with Myroslava, whom I've known ever since I got to Ohio State. She was a stalwart in the Department of the History of Art and such a wonderful scholar. So, Myroslava, can you tell us a little bit about where you're from, how many times you've been able to go back to Ukraine, and how you see the country as changing since the fall of the USSR in 1991? This is a long time ago. Ukraine has been its own country for a long time, but clearly not everyone in Russia agrees with that.
Well, thank you. First of all, a little bit about myself. I'm an Ohioan. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. My parents came to the United States after the Second World War. My mother, who is still living, always tells a story of when the Russians came into their village and how they had to fend for themselves. And then the Germans came into their village and took away their entire family and all the families and brought them to Germany to work. This is during the Second World War. So my mother left her homeland at age 10. And today I think about the children who are refugees from Ukraine, who are about that age, and what they will be telling their children and their friends and their generation when they reach 90, as my mother has reached recently. It seems history is repeating itself. But as an Ohioan, I also want you to know that I'm a product of the Ukrainian diaspora, that is, those emigres who came to the United States without language, without money, without jobs. They were sponsored by the US government, but they had to find their way. So this cycle of emigres and refugees is really repeating itself again. And it is the Ukrainian people who are repeating their history again. This is very important to mention because as I was growing up in Cleveland, I knew who I was, I knew where my roots were, and from kindergarten through high school and on to college, every time I said I was Ukrainian, "Oh, you're Russian." "Yeah, we know." "No, I'm not Russian, I'm Ukrainian. I'm different from any Russian. I speak Ukrainian. We have our separate culture. We have our separate language. We have our separate history. We are not Russians." So to bring it to this present moment, I am heartened, I am gratified that the world is finally recognizing that Ukrainians are not Russians. There's a reason why they speak Russian. That's historical, that's political, I could explain it. But they are not Russians. They do not feel themselves to be Russians. And this is why they're fighting to the death to protect their own sovereignty. They do not want to be Russians, and they do not need any kind of liberation from Russia. And the world has to recognize this. There's nothing that can be discussed at a table when you have a colonizer telling those who he has colonized that they must succumb to his colonization tactics. This will not work. 44 million people who do not want to be Russian will not succumb to these ultimatums. And so we can expect a lot more war ahead until we can finally get rid of the colonizer.
No, that's absolutely one of the things that I think is really important, and I've even been thinking about this myself. Sometimes in academia we talk about decolonizing ourselves, and lately I have, over the last 10 years, have had to think about what my education meant when we traced Russian history and Russian literature to Kyiv. But that wasn't Russia, right? So I'm having to rethink all of those Russian-speaking authors that I've been teaching for many years and have been teaching them as Russians because they were Russian-speaking, but they were from Kyiv or they were from somewhere else in Ukraine. They were Ukrainians. So this idea of Russophonic Ukrainians is something that's really important, and it's one of the ways in which the propaganda coming out of Russia has enabled people to be confused about, oh, well, they're Russian-speaking, they must be Russians. No, we have for many years now had Ukrainian-American academics like Sergei Zhuk from Ball State University, like Myroslava Mudrak, telling us, no, we are either Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians or Ukrainian-Americans, or indeed Russian-speaking Ukrainians or Ukrainian-Americans. The language is not what we're talking about the culture. Right. Thank you so much, Myroslava. I want us all to keep, this is a conversation. We're going to come back and forth. I don't know if anybody wanted to add something, jump in on that. I'll be introducing each of you. You've already been introduced, so we can always talk. All right. So, I wanted to then maybe turn to Philip, who is a second-year student in our program. He actually is from Northern Ohio, went to Walsh University, and then went on to do a Fulbright in Ukraine. So some of you, your children, your neighbors may have done Fulbright, what we call ETAs. It's an English teaching assistantship in a foreign country where you're able to go and be an ambassador for the United States government and also learn more about the culture. And Philip then applied to graduate school, in part because he was pulled out of Kharkiv. He had been living in Kharkiv. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and he had to come home. Luckily for me, I found him and recruited him to come here to Ohio State, where he's been studying in our degree program. But one of the really cool things that Philip has been doing is he's really, those Fulbright groups stay very closely intertwined, even the kind of the alumni. So he's been interacting with his other folks who were in Ukraine in that pandemic year, 2019, 2020. And he and one of his colleagues have started a newsletter. And I was looking at it today and seeing that they're using photos from another one of their colleagues from that Fulbright alumni group. So maybe you could talk, Philip, a little bit about what you hear happening in Kharkiv. How are you getting your news from Kharkiv? And also, what sources do you look for this Ukraine Unlocked newsletter that you launched in some ways, quite serendipitously maybe, right before the war started?
Yeah. We started Ukraine Unlocked. We launched in January. We had started working on it in October, so horribly great timing, I guess. So, but part of the Fulbright program, as Angela said, was to be a cultural ambassador. And a lot of the news stories coming out right now really don't capture that human essence. So before I get into the news sources that I use, I just want to pull out some experiences from my friend Mykyta, who lived in Kharkiv for the last 6 years. I did an interview with him 2 weeks ago about his experiences during the first about week of the invasion, and I think his experience is very powerful and just humanizes the war, because we usually just hear about the military maneuvers or the political happenings or the economic effects, and we kind of miss out on what's happening to everyday people. So he, leading up to the war, actually had no idea that he did not think the invasion was going to happen. He thought it was all a big bluff. He had actually moved from to Lviv from October to December of 2021, and then moved back to Kharkiv for work because he just did not think an invasion was going to happen. Well, now in hindsight, he knows he messed up. But he woke up at 5 a.m. on the 24th to the sounds of shelling, and he immediately knew, oh my God, the invasion started. He didn't even have to check his phone. So he gathered as many his documents, his computer, his backpack, and some clothes, and ran to the metro station, where he stayed on and off for the next 48 hours. He came out a couple times to get some supplies. He went to the grocery store. He stood in line for 2 hours just to get some water. He slept on the concrete floor in the metro station with hundreds of other people for 2 nights. He waited in a 2.5-hour line just to use the bathroom. It was literally a living hell. But after 48 hours, on the evening of the 26th, he decided, okay, I need to do something. I need to get out of here. So I'm going to read a quote from the interview I did with him, just to capture the essence of his experience in the metro and why he decided to leave. Once we got back into the metro, it just felt like you were in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for something to happen. I felt helpless and kept thinking that I am going to die. My mind kept replaying the thought of a bomb being dropped onto the metro station. The only thing you want to do at this point is to survive. On Friday night, I decided we had to try and get to Lviv. I could not sit there and feel helpless anymore. At the time, there were really no right or wrong decisions, but I felt as though that it was the best decision for us, for him and his roommate. I ordered a taxi, and we made our way across the ghost town that was Kharkiv. We were the only car on the road, and I kept thinking that a missile was going to hit us. Seeing unexploded missiles lodged into the road definitely justified my fears. I was also anxious that we would not be able to make it to the train station. But that was a risk we were willing to take. Again, there was no right or wrong decisions in this moment. It was just a decision that seemed like the best at the time. The fear of dying was propelling me forward through every decision. I just wanted to live. Well, Mykyta eventually made it to the train station, and he took the 18-hour journey across Ukraine to Lviv, where he's been for the last 3 weeks. He does feel safer now, but he also feels like he's just a sitting duck waiting for the Russian forces to come. He's active in volunteering in the city and knows that Lviv is preparing to fight for the death. He's only 22 years old, and he just graduated college. He doesn't know how to hold a gun. He has no military experience. He's terrified of getting drafted. He is patriotic, and he does support Ukraine and love Ukraine, but he's also just a young man with his whole life ahead of him. So, and I think the overall mood in Ukraine is very optimistic, and everyone I know is hopeful that the Ukrainian military will continue to prove the doubters wrong and repel Russian attacks. Ukrainians are disappointed that NATO countries have not intervened more, but they are hopeful that economic sanctions against Russia, combined with the military aid coming to Ukraine, will be enough to help beat the Russians. So the sources I use to stay up to date, of course, with my friends, social media is a super powerful tool. I call and talk to my friend Mykyta every day or every other day. So thankfully they have internet, electricity where they're at. The messaging app, Telegram, Twitter, Instagram is a good way that I keep up on my personal connections. But beyond those personal contacts, I immerse myself in several different outlets for my weekly newsletter on Ukraine. Ukraine Unlocked is more for a general audience, trying to make it more accessible to everyday people. So when compiling, I have 2 go-to sources from Ukraine that are English language. So the Kyiv Independent and then Ukrinform are my top 2 choices for day-to-day updates about the military and experiences of individuals on the ground. And then for more common Western media outlets, I would say Reuters, the Associated Press, sometimes the New York Post and Washington Post are good, but I always try and look at it with some degree of scrutiny because there's a lot of reporters who recently became Ukraine experts. So yeah, I would say I always try to look to the Ukrainian sources first. Those are always my go-to, and then I can fill in the gaps with some other Western media outlets.
Your story of Mykyta really resonates with what Myroslava was saying about her mother's family. I mean, this is one of the things that really struck everybody when the bombings started, is they all began to think about June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans bombed Kyiv, and that war began. So it's been a really tough time for young people, and that's really, one of the things that we read about, right, is that women and children are fleeing, and the men can't cross the border because Ukraine has made this rule that you have to be prepared to fight. If you're a man, you have to be prepared to be drafted into the army, and people are doing that, but it's terrifying, right? It's terrifying. Imagine that. Imagine how Mykyta must feel. Thank you so much for that. I really want to recommend this newsletter. It gives you images and voices and stories that you might not get somewhere else. And I'm really excited to be a subscriber myself, so I recommend subscribing. I wanted to ask Mykyta, our Mykyta, whose name I keep trying to learn how to pronounce in Ukrainian. He's being very gentle with me. When we recruited him, Mykyta actually spent some time in California and has taught sort of Russian in California. He studied a little Italian when he was there at Pomona College. And I recruited him to graduate school. He's actually in the Languages and Cultures department, and he's probably going to write on Ukrainian film at this point. But he keeps trying to help me because I speak Russian. I'm a Russian speaker, and those vowels are different in Ukrainian. So Mykyta, Tyshchenko. I'm getting better, right? So Mykyta, I really, you're our only Ukrainian citizen up here, and I know it's all hitting really close to home for you. So my thought was maybe you could talk a little bit more about this idea of Russophone versus Ukrainophone populations. Even Ukrainophone, it's not a word that I'm used to using. Most of you probably don't use the word Russophone as often as I do. But one of the things that we're all doing, we're all on social media, and yes, we do also, professors use Facebook. And my cousin was commenting on something, my cousin in Indiana, who's just a regular guy, right? And he said, look, why can't this war stop? He's worried about the gas prices. And he says, why can't you just let Putin have the parts of Ukraine where the Russians live? So I wondered if maybe, Mykyta, maybe you have some ideas about what it means to be Russian or to be Russian-speaking in Ukraine and how any of that has changed over the last 8 years.
What a complicated
I know, I
question.
like to ask a hard question.
The language matter is very complicated with Ukraine. As you just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it is very hard to untangle who is actually Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking in Ukraine because, Ukraine was under Soviet rule for 70 years and the lingua franca was Russian. So everyone, absolutely everyone in Ukraine is Russian, Ukrainian, bilingual, including me. And the only difference is which one was your first language. Did you grow up speaking Ukrainian, then learned Russian, or did you grow up speaking Russian and learned Ukrainian? I'm the latter. My family's from Crimea, and we all are Russian-speaking. And I grew up surrounded by many languages, not just Ukrainian and Russian, but also Armenian because of diaspora, and Yiddish too, and then Crimean Tatar. And I remember being a child and knowing some of those words just so that I could play with children around me. But when it comes to language use, especially the last 8 years kind of made it obvious that, or the events of 2014 when the Crimea got annexed and then when war in Donbass region in the east of Ukraine started, we realized that Russian has been used as a weapon against Ukraine by saying that Russian is the language that is under constant attack by the government and the people, which is not true. Just my observation, living in Ukraine for 22 years and traveling around Ukraine to different parts of it, I was never asked to switch to Ukrainian when I spoke Russian or any other language, but I was very often asked to switch to Russian when I spoke Ukrainian. So we're talking about this strategy of polarizing Ukraine that is already bilingual, but half of Ukrainians will prefer using Ukrainian in everyday speech and the other half will prefer to use Russian in everyday speech. We see this tendency to polarize it and, push these two groups of Ukrainians against each other. So when it comes to, giving Russia the lands that speak Russian, will not work because all of Ukraine will speak Russian to some extent and all of Ukraine will also speak Ukrainian to some extent. So it's either, leaving it alone or annexing it all and joining into Russia, which is not possible. And then when it comes to Russian or Ukrainian ethnicity-wise, well, I guess like in every country, you can be of one ethnicity, but support the actions of the government that is right next to you, right to your neighboring country. And of course, there are ethnic Russians who integrated to Ukrainian society to such extent that they don't separate really anymore. They don't even call themselves a part of Russian diaspora. They're just Russians that live in Ukraine and belong to the society and culture and use the language to some extent they can, and so on. And there are also Ukrainians who are more sympathetic to the actions of Russia because maybe they are sympathetic to the times or nostalgic for times that they spent in Soviet Union, for example. So there are always people that will have an opinion that does not necessarily go with the government or the popular opinion of the population, just like in any country, right? So giving up those lands will be something like, well, you know, California speaks Spanish, so let's just give it back to Mexico, right? It's the absolute same statement then. Is it valid? I don't think so. I think it's up for people to decide where they want to go. And it seems like Ukraine, its population, regardless, Russian, Ukrainian speaking, Hungarian speaking, there are Ukrainians that speak Hungarian at home, or Polish. Ethnicity-wise, same thing. If they want to stay with Ukraine and in Ukraine that is independent, then let's just let them do that. Let them be in Ukraine, right?
I tried to use with my cousin the example of Ireland. You know, that just because the Irish speak English doesn't mean that they want to be part of England or live in England, right? So, yeah.
I was fortunate enough, I've had a good life, and I've been fortunate enough to have been in the Soviet Union to do research for my dissertation in the 70s during the Brezhnev era. Lots of stories to tell there. But I'm happy to have had that experience when it comes to language and identity, because I can compare it with Ukraine after the Soviet Union fell apart and what has happened to the population as it evolved towards its own Ukrainian identity. It's a wonderful story. When I was in Ukraine in the 70s, in the late 70s, nobody spoke Ukrainian. I didn't know Russian. I spoke Ukrainian. So even if I would ask directions in the street, I would ask in Ukrainian, and I would get this stunned look before they responded. But they responded in Ukrainian. They responded in Ukrainian. And the same thing, talking to people in the market, anywhere, in someone's apartment, I could only speak Ukrainian. And after a few sentences, they would switch to Ukrainian, and they knew it. There was no problem. The transition was not a problem. The functionalism of the Russian language is what made it the dominant language during the Soviet era. The mixing of populations from one Soviet republic into another, it assimilated people where they could really communicate only with one language. And if you talk to people who, in Poltava, for example, and Poltava is considered to be the heart of pure Ukrainian historically. If you ask people, why are you speaking Russian? Because we were told, if you want to survive at your job, if you want to advance in any way, if you want your children to be included in any kind of program that will allow them to survive, you need to speak Russian. Teachers who spoke in Russian were given higher pay than teachers who spoke in Ukrainian. What do you do in a society that is pressured that way from outside? You succumb. You want your family to survive. You want to survive. And before that, in the 19th century, the Tsars had issued edicts that the Ukrainian language was banned. You could not publish in the Ukrainian language. You could not perform theater in the Ukrainian language. You could not speak in the Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian language was preserved by those who lived in the villages, the farmers. They're the ones who allowed that language to survive. And yet, if we go to Stalin's time, those farmers who were being forcibly collectivized by Stalin were killed off. Over 4 million people died of this starvation, of this Holodomor, as it's called, death by starvation, a genocide by starvation. Their homes were vacant. The land was vacant. Who occupied those territories? Well, it's Putin's playbook today. Bring in the Russians, they'll occupy those territories. Are they going to speak Ukrainian? Not. They speak Russian. And so that's why that entire eastern terrain, all those eastern lands are mostly Russian speaking. And it was a very intense program that Ukrainians and really all peoples of the Soviet Union had to endure, that introduction of the functional Russian language. Now, once the Soviet Union collapsed, quietly, because there's a lot of fear in the population, Ukrainian was coming back. And government programs were issued in order to start introducing Ukrainian as the official language of the new state, independent of the USSR, separate and sovereign. And of course, this was a hard birth for the Ukrainian language because there was a lot of resistance. It was easier to speak Russian, and Russian was everywhere. But since 1991 until now, the Ukrainian language has become stronger. And with every new generation, it becomes their language of conversation. If you look at the journalists, if you look at the population, the younger professional population, it's all Ukrainian. And the language, and I will have a bias here, but it's a beautiful, beautiful language. The vocabulary, there are 10 Ukrainian words for every one Russian word. It is a very lyrical language, it's a beautiful language, and it reflects, I don't mind saying, the soul of the Ukrainians, who are peace-loving, who are not warmongers, who write poetry, who paint paintings that are beautiful. And speaking of paintings, I'm an art historian. Most of Ukraine's culture, most of Ukraine's high culture can be found in Russian museums. Everything from Scythian art, which dates back to the 8th century BC, the Trypillian culture, a Neolithic culture that was born on Ukrainian land in the area of Kyiv. Even those great 19th century painters that some of you might know, Repin is Ukrainian. They just bombed his hometown, Chuhuyev, near Kharkiv. The great portraits of the Russian court, the great portraits that you see of Catherine II, those were painted by Ukrainian painters who were brought to the Russian court. The music, any of you who are interested in classical music, the music of the 18th century was written by Ukrainian composers who came from a musical school that is near Kharkiv, today Hluchiv. They had a beautiful musical school there, and one by one, these talented people would be picked off and brought to Russia. And this is what Putin is claiming that Russian culture is built on. It's all appropriated. It's all appropriated. So I just wanted to say that the identity of Ukrainians has been made even stronger by this war. And because that identity is so strong, it really, really depends on us not to let it die, not to let it fade. And they really need to know that the rest of the world is behind them, because they see them not as an object that can be moved here and there or divided, but rather as a subject of culture that dare not be destroyed anymore. Sorry for the passion.
Myroslava, thank you so much. And you know, that that idea, the word partition has been coming up already, and that's really something very fearful. And in fact, maybe this is a great opportunity for Chris to talk. Chris Gelpi is an expert in peace studies. So where do we see this? When the escalation happened, I thought there is no end game. But for Putin, I don't see what the end game is, except it's not going to work. But what do you see in terms of the future? What might happen?
Yeah.
Based on other examples, maybe.
Right. So thank you for having me as part of this forum. I want to start off by saying I'm grateful to be here. I feel like I'm an outsider here because I can't speak to the sort of human aspect of this. I have a more of an international perspective to bring, and I want to be clear in saying that I don't think that kind of international relations theory is bigger or more important than the human level, but it is a different perspective that I think needs to be factored in as well. So going to your question about what happens going forward, one thing I have to say is that unfortunately I don't think there's much reason to expect the economic sanctions to do very much to stop Putin from in terms of changing his war aims. There's a lot of evidence that sanctions rarely work. They certainly very rarely work in terms of getting states to change their aims in the middle of war. And I've also seen people hoping that it would cause Putin's government to collapse. There's very little evidence that sanctions like this have a record of causing autocratic leaders to collapse. South Africa is a separate kind of exception I could talk about, but isn't really relevant here. And another thing I would add to that is that we should be careful what we wish for in terms of wishing for Putin to collapse, because we have a lot of experience now with taking down very bad dictators and finding out that actually what comes after that isn't necessarily any better than what we had before. So I would just be very cautious about whether economic sanctions are likely to do very much here. I think the real determinant of what happens is going to have to do with military results on the ground and the kind of diplomatic response that both sides have to those. And so what's really key here in terms of Western influence on this is actually the military levers that we can give to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. We've already seen that they've put up much more effective resistance than I think most people expected them to do. Obviously, the West needs to be careful in terms of not escalating this to a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States, which could end the world. But I think there are a lot of ways in which we can make the military campaign costly for Russia that I think could make a big difference. In terms of what are the end games there, I see a couple of different end games, none of which are very satisfactory. One path I do see that is possible is towards a negotiated settlement. But a negotiated settlement would be painful, I think, for both sides, but especially thinking in this context for the Ukrainian side. A negotiated settlement would probably look something like a Ukraine that gives up its claims to Crimea and to probably Donetsk and Luhansk, and which are the areas that we've been talking about in terms of the Russification that happened and so on. And I don't at all, and there would probably need to be a lifting of sanctions on Russia in exchange for some promise that Ukraine would not ever be part of NATO. In exchange for some sort of joint, the United States and Russia would have to participate in this together to jointly defend the sort of neutrality of Ukraine. That's not an ideal settlement. It does divide what is divides a sense of national identity, and it does violence to the concept of national self-determination. But I think there's reason to believe that it might be acceptable to Putin. He has actually used the word compromise, and so that's the kind of thing that I think a compromise might look like. And he's also, if you look at his behavior in places like Georgia, he has been willing to accept halfway solutions, where Russia takes part of the territory and not the rest. And so it would be for the West to determine with the Ukrainian people whether they're willing to accept that. The other possibility is a stalemate and an long-term insurgency, a guerrilla war. And I think as much as we want to defend the rights of the Ukrainian people for national self-determination, I think we also need to understand how extremely costly that would be to the Ukrainian people and potentially to the whole world economy if you think about this sort of sanctions regime going on. So in terms of parallel cases that we could think about that might have a better solution, people have talked a lot about China and Taiwan in this context as a comparison. And I actually think China and Taiwan represents, although it's not totally satisfactory, the good outcome that could happen from this, right? Because there's been flexibility on both sides there in terms of national self-determination, where Taiwan has this kind of in-between status, right? Where it's not really an independent country, but it's not really part of China. And while that's not fully satisfactory to either side, it has largely kept the peace. And I would argue that Taiwan has been better off in that kind of scenario than, say, a Ukraine would be better off in what could be, you know, I think we've seen that Putin is willing to put up with a long-term, very costly conflict. So I'll stop there.
So much, Chris. That's really helpful. You know, Taiwan has the advantage of being an island.
Yes.
So that makes a difference. So I really we have to move to questions from our live stream and our in-person audience. So it is CMC's long-standing tradition to take those audience questions, and Doug Buchanan is going to curate them. So Doug, who's our first question?
Dr. Brintlinger, thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists today. Our first question was actually pre-submitted with a registration, and it comes from Gavin Hodge with the Columbus Council of World Affairs Global Scholars Diploma Program. Gavin says, when we eventually get to a point where there is regime change in Russia, whether it be next week or in the next decade, how can we ensure that the Russian people respect the West, as it would be in the best interest of U.S. and European states to have a Russian public that respects us, meaning the U.S., rather than fears us?
They want to take that. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
So, I mean, I am just deeply skeptical of our ability to influence regime change in other countries. And I'm even more deeply skeptical of our ability to shape how other governments are going to respond to our regime change. I think foreign imposed regime change has a very, very bad record of building up stable societies, and I just don't think that that's something that the United States can try to do. I think that we need to think about what are our principles and what are our interests and act upon those with integrity. And then others, the chips fall where they may. But I think we make a mistake when we think that we can shape when we can manipulate Russian internal politics in that way.
Another question?
Good afternoon. I'm Patrick McLean. I'm the CFO for the Adam H. Board, but today I'm wearing my International Relations master's degree hat, I think. I wonder if you would respond to a notion that has gotten some play in the media and in academic circles about where the fault lies for all this. And I want to be clear that I don't subscribe to this view at all, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. And that narrative goes something like this, that this never needed to happen, it never would have happened if only NATO had not expanded, if only we had not pushed NATO into the neighborhood, if we can call it that, of Russia. In other words, a sort of Monroe Doctrine, if you will, for the Russian perimeter areas.
That's a great question. I know that Chris probably has the answer, but maybe Philip, do you have a view?
Well, I'm pretty sure that NATO countries are already in NATO, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, right? Yeah, already have NATO membership. So, you know, NATO is already next door to Russia. So I think it's more so Putin's attempt to control the political happenings in Ukraine as opposed to a defensive move because NATO is already next door. to Russia.
Be really aware of the media influence inside Russia and outside Russia. I think a lot of what we hear is pre-scripted for us. Some of the things that we sometimes believe have been scripted for us as well. Chris?
Yeah, I think I would actually take a somewhat different view than that. So certainly if we want to ask whose fault is this war, clearly it's Putin's fault, right? I mean, he's invaded another country, and so it's Putin's fault, full stop. However, given the existence of Vladimir Putin, I think it was quite foreseeable that he would respond to NATO expansion in the way that he did. And in particular, if you think about the combination of policies of expanding NATO to his border where he doesn't want, not including Georgia or Ukraine, promising that you will include Georgia and Ukraine in the future, but also asserting that we will not use military force to defend Ukraine, that's a policy that is leaving the door about as open as you can to Putin invading. So this is Putin's fault, but there are a lot of things that we could have done to prevent it, and we didn't.
Yeah, I'm Jane Scott with the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Chris, talk a little bit more about your sanctions. I was very skeptical at the beginning, too, like this is just sort of, flicking Putin in the head. But they've got some pretty serious stuff going on now in terms of all the countries, or all the companies from the United States and throughout the world, even the South Pacific countries pulling out of doing business there. Now, if I was a business person and operating in my business, whether it's McDonald's or XYZ, in Russia and was threatened personally, my assets were threatened, and my business and employees were threatened, if and when I got out, it would be a long, long time before I would ever consider doing business in Russia. So the economy in Russia is going to change so dramatically no matter how long this war goes on, because people are not going to go back there to do business.
So I want to be clear in saying I'm not trying to say that sanctions won't damage the Russian economy. They definitely will. And I'm not saying that they won't hurt the livelihoods of the Russian people or the Russian sort of business owners. It definitely will. But what the problem is that leaders like Putin have an ability to insulate themselves from those kinds of costs. And so if you look at places like Cuba, Cuba's been under massive sanctions for decades, right? And the leaders can insulate themselves. The same thing was true in Iraq. The same thing is true in Iran. And in this particular case, because you have China as this sort of huge opening in the sanctions in terms of the market for Russian energy, and you have the fact that European countries, they'll try to cut back on Russian energy, but they can't get rid of it all. There's just a huge gap that won't be able to be closed, and so there'll be enough resources there for Putin to pay off the people that he needs to pay off in order to stay alive and stay in power. And so it'll be horrible for Russia, but I don't think it'll change Putin.
Exactly right, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Also say that sanctions also have loopholes. As of at least a week ago, Goldman Sachs was acting as a middleman between U.S. investors and Russian creditors. So they were basically enabling U.S. investors to buy Russian debt securities at an all-time low. And then obviously they'll be able to sell it for a profit in the future, but that's giving Russian oligarchs access to much needed cash. And 34, as of 2 days ago, 34 companies were still, US-based companies were still operating in Russia around the loopholes, or around the sanctions. So there are ways to get around the sanctions still, so they aren't a complete blockade.
Yes.
My name is Tony Bell, and I'm with Phoenix Consulting Company and a board member here. I'd like to, I think Dr. Myroslava, you've encouraged me to rethink the way I'm going to ask this question, because you said, in a way, that the people need to know that the world is behind them. And one of my classmates right now wrote a letter in our group our WhatsApp, and it says, "Dear classmates, I need your help. As you may know, I'm Ukrainian, and I have my entire family in Ukraine, including my 18-year-old brother. I am putting together medical supplies, a medical supplies parcel for them. They have nothing. Everything was sent to the front lines, and there are no reserves in Ukraine. Putin bombed medical factories, and they can't buy anything in Europe because they can't leave and because of limited availability. They're asking me to ship it from the U.S. I already spent all of my money, and it's just not enough. And the situation is dire. If you can donate something, could really appreciate it." And so as classmates, we are all gathering to support. My soul is in pain for what's happening in the Ukraine. My soul is in pain for history repeating itself. And I am wondering how, when I see what's happening, and I remember in 2018, Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said that we will not be receiving migrants from the Middle East or North Africa in Poland. And what I see is that when it comes to Black and brown people needing support and refuge, they're often denied, or when they get to the country, they have very limited resources, and it's so hard to survive, and it's hard for them to get their families back here. What would you suggest that the world does at this point in time, not just to support the Ukrainian people, but for all people who find themselves in this situation, irrespective of their heritage or their skin color?
Yes, I'm very sensitive to that, and I also, as I read posts on the social media where people are asking for help, I will also think about the posts that I get from other places in the world where white people don't live, who are saying, we need help too. It is a world crisis, and it's a world crisis brought about by ideologies and dictators and egomaniacs and megalomaniacs. And so I get very restless when we dance around Putin. I get very restless when America is trying to protect its interests when it should be fighting the Hydra. I'm sorry that she left, but I think what this war, maybe because it's white people who are becoming refugees now, but it has kind of brought Europe together, and it has introduced humanity back into the human soul, and it is, I think, a good start for us to think about helping all these people who are the subjects of totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, because it just keeps repeating. It just keeps repeating. And I think America should be a leader here. And I think it's an opportunity to become a leader here. And it means using force against those who would try to change the world order according to their very narrow-minded, maniacal worldview.
This question is coming up a lot for all of us, and it's coming up for people in Ukraine as well. The question of racism in media, racism in reactions to refugee situations. The only hope that I have is that if we can help Ukraine withstand this, that's huge for the entire world, precisely because of grain exports. You know, a lot of the world depends on Ukraine's grain, including places in Africa and the Middle East. Okay. So two words, because we have to wrap up. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, just real quick, I would say in terms of how we talk about this crisis, it's always made me uncomfortable when people talk about this as unprecedented and so on. And because it's not. Like, this happens around the world all the time. It's terrible. That doesn't undermine how terrible it is here, but it's not unprecedented. It's only unprecedented in Europe.
And that's really important. When you see people saying things like, children are being bombed. Well, children are being bombed all over the world all the time, and we need to pay attention to it. So if we pay attention to Ukraine, maybe that will help us pay attention to other places. That's our only hope in terms of this, I think. Mykyta, do you have one more word? Because you got...
Yes, I do. To the question, this and the previous migratory crises, because Europe has been witnessing them actively since 2016, right? Massive migration flows. What I think we are missing on is we have these shared policies, we share economies, there's cultural exchange, we make political agreements, economic agreements, but there's no worldwide network that will deal with consequences of war or disasters like this. Are there any programs that will, or do all of the governments actively create economy or sectors in economy that will protect potential migrants, right? We are not ready for migration in the world. I don't think that it should be this hard to leave your country or enter a country when your life is under the threat. And unfortunately, it is very hard to do so now. And with Ukraine and Poland, it's a little different because, our economies are very intertwined and we had special access to country for a long time. That's why it's so easy for Ukrainians to leave for Poland. But I think that should be the case for everyone everywhere.
Thank you so much. Well, we are wrapping up. I really want to tell you that we are delighted to have been able to be here for you, to be able to talk with you, and to share our knowledge and expertise. And I'm sure if you have any interest in looking at the programs at the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, we're doing Ukraine Wednesdays. If you're interested, pop into one of our Zooms, contact any of our panelists. We're all at osu.edu. Thanks.
Okay, well, I hope you found today's forum interesting. Please make plans to join us on Wednesday, March 23rd for Ohio's Prosperity Linked to Workforce. That'll feature Steve Stivers, who's the president and CEO of the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank again today's presenting sponsor, the Columbus Council on World Affairs, and today's forum sponsor, the Ohio State University. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And a special appreciation for today's speakers, Christopher Gelpi, Philip Kopatz, Myroslava Mudrak, and Mykyta. Can you just say it for me? There you go. Okay. And our host, Angela Brintlinger. Thank you all for joining us. We could not do this without you. We look forward to seeing you next week as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Have a great day, everybody.